so excited to have Gordon Brewer with me today because I have actually been on your podcast a few times. So the fact that I get to have you on my podcast, I'm super excited. Hi, Gordon.
Hi, Dana. Glad to be here.
So you have a podcast that's called The Practice of Therapy. And one of the things that I want everyone to know is maybe you don't want to listen to it because you're not a therapist, but you are such a warm and engaging host. You are, of all the podcasts I've ever been on, you are the one that has made me feel the most comfortable, the most at ease, and more like I was talking to a friend. So I want to thank you for that because you've shaped my podcast experiences in life.
Well, good. You're kind to say that. And I've got actually another podcast out now as well called the Kindness and Compassion Podcast.
Oh, okay. People can about that.
Yeah. So it really looks at, and this might be, I know we were chatting before we started recording just about spirituality, but the Kindness and Compassion podcast is really the main goal of it is to help people live into more kindness and compassion in their life and in their world, and really help kind of hopefully end some of the polarization that we're all experiencing just in the world and in our society. But it looks at the intersection of psychology, spirituality, religion, and just how we can all live into using those different aspects to live into more kindness and compassion, not only to others, but to ourselves. So.
Oh my God. I didn't even know. And I'm such a big fan of yours. I will definitely check that out because I think now more than ever, that's something that is needed and timely. Okay. So part of that comes from, and people who are listening to are just learning about you, but you are not only a marriage and family therapist, but you are also an ordained clergy, right? So a vocation, I wrote this down. You're a vocational deacon in the Episcopal Church.
Yes, yes, that is correct.
For those of us that don't know what that means, what kind of role do you take in the church?
Yeah, so in the Episcopal Church is really is out of the Anglican tradition. Not to go too far down a rabbit hole, but if you're familiar with the Church of England, and if anybody watched Harry and Meg's wedding on TV or saw it, that was in an Anglican or a Church of England church. And so the Episcopal Church is what became of the Church of England in the United States after the Revolutionary War. So, but within that tradition, there are three orders of clergy. There are bishops, priests, and deacons. And the bishop is, of course, oversees a diocese and that sort of thing. And a priest is typically the pastor of a particular parish or church. A deacon, though, our ministry is really in the world, and that we are kind of the bridge between the church and the world. And so I serve, although I'm kind of in between parishes, but usually the bishop will assign me to a parish and I'll serve in that parish, much like an assistant, that kind of thing, but also do stuff like that. But a big part of my ministry, even though I'm not a faith-based practice, my ministry I see as just working with people in the counseling and therapy realm. And so just really, that's, to me, it's a calling, and just there's some little bit, I see myself as really more of a faith-informed practice rather than a faith-based practice.
Okay, so which came first, the deacon or the therapist?
Well, they kind of coincided. I was kind of going through the process of ordination and that kind of thing just shortly after I graduated from grad school. And so it'd been kind of a tug along the way, but I probably, as I like to say, I came to it kind of kicking and screaming because I never really thought I would be doing something like this. But again, with a calling, it's kind of you feel compelled to do something that's greater and bigger than yourself.
Do they ever go in conflict with each other? Is it ever problematic?
Yeah, no, I make it a point to do that in my work with clients and with couples and and folks within my practice, I'm very upfront about that. Say, I wear kind of two hats. I'm clergy person, but also therapist. I don't have a religious agenda with my therapy. I'm, traditionally trained and licensed and that sort of thing in the therapeutic world. But I tell folks, I don't have a religious agenda. If those are ever things you want to talk about, I'm happy to talk about those things, but you're not going to hear it from me first. And really my stance on it all is that I think a person, there's my job is not to convert people or try to convince them that my way is the way of doing it. It works for me. I'm happy to share that. But I think everybody has to find their own path when it comes to spirituality, or even, if they have no spirituality, that's okay as well. I think, ultimately my job is to hear people where they are and give them feedback and offer them insight, and also help them find ways to change and grow and be whole people.
Do you find that there are many couples that struggle over being different faiths or having different religious views when they are in a relationship?
Yeah, it can come into play. And I
Uh-huh.
think, I think one of the things about it is that, I know that I believe, if I remember correctly, Dana, you're Gottman trained. Is
Yep.
that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the
Certified.
Gottman method, and I think about their the hierarchy. No, it's not the hierarchy, but it's the sound relationship house, that graphic
Yep.
that we're all familiar with. And at the very bottom of it, I forget how they frame it, but to me, it's about a couple understanding each other's world,
Yes.
in their internal world, and then treating that with kindness and compassion. So it might be that you don't quite understand another person's perspective, but you can embrace that, and you can validate that with the other person.
Yeah.
But I think, sometimes there are, depending on a person's faith tradition and the uh, faith path or non-faith path or whatever, that can create some conflict for people.
Why do you think it's so, I'm going to use a big word, threatening for one partner that holds a belief? We could even take it broader than religion if that didn't feel okay. Like if I've
Mhm.
had clients where maybe one identifies with one political party and the other identifies with the other political party. We could
Right,
even extend the conversation that way. And it
right.
seems so threatening that my partner does not view the world from that perspective. What in your experience is the reason that that feels so unsettling or so not tolerable?
Well, yeah. I think at a base level, it's based in fear, and
Mm,
that, I think, not to go too far into brain science, but I think a lot of times in my mind, anger is a superficial emotion. It's what we
mhm.
see on the surface. But what drives anger underneath is usually fear and hurt.
Yep.
And so somebody, it might be that they get angry about things because they've been hurt by the church or religion, that kind of thing. And so they have that particular view. In political views, certainly, I think a lot of that comes from how we grew up and how we, the values that were instilled in us, along the way, not only from our parents, but also just society in general. But I think if we can get at that of understanding, as I like to say, why a person is like they are, that's when we can begin to alleviate the fear. Um, the other thing too, in just working with couples, is moving them from that pattern of criticism and defensiveness,
Yeah.
again, that the Gottmans talk about,
Yep.
and the stonewalling and the contempt, and the four horsemen of the apocalypse. In my mind, instead of being defensive about something, if you can turn on the curiosity and be curious about what's going on with the other person rather than getting on the defensive. And then on the criticism side of things, when you can learn to make requests of your partner rather than demands or criticisms, those kinds of things, that changes the whole tone of the conversations and how they approach things.
You're speaking my language, Gordon.
Yeah.
My favorite phrase around the office is, "Can you be curious versus furious?" Right?
Yes.
We're not in
Yes.
conflict because we don't love each other. We're in conflict because I have my own expectations, family of origin, religious upbringings, political group, right? And so I have
Right.
expectations that I'm worried
Mhm.
that you're not going to acknowledge or won't validate or worse judge me for. And so
Yeah.
I get furious that you're different than me versus,
Mhm.
tell me about that. I don't have to change my perspective because you have your perspective. We can coexist in that space.
Right, right. And I think, I think too, if we can understand, if people can begin to look at where they're the same rather than where they're different, it helps bring us together more. I mean, it's, I think about, particularly issues, it could be the same could apply to religion or spirituality. But if you could look at the very core of what it is that they're seeking or what they're wanting out of things, they're probably pretty close, if not the same. It's just that the way that you get there is the difference. So, I think about parenting, when you start finding couples that are arguing about how to parent their children, you say, okay, what are your hopes and dreams for your children? What do you want them to learn through all of this? What kind of person do you want them to be when they grow up? And when they start sharing that, it's usually exactly the same things that they want. It's just how do you get there is where they're having the differences.
So instead of coming at each other from the opposing view, it's like, let's start with what do we have in common? Because that's going to solidify that we actually have more in common than we think we do. It's
Right.
just we're looking at it through different lenses. And maybe instead of like, why are you opposite than me? What do we have in common? And let's build from that.
Mhm. Right, right.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things I use in my office, there's a optical illusion picture or whatever, and I'm sure a lot of folks have seen it. If you look at it in one way, it looks like an old woman, and then look at another, it looks like a young woman.
Yep.
So what I love to do with couples is hold the picture up and say, okay, what do you see, an old woman or a young woman? And what's really great is that they see they see the opposite. And so we talk about that as, your brain clicks on something first. And in order to see the other, you have to make a shift in your brain. But the kind of the bottom line of all of that is it's not either or, but it's both and. And so a lot of times for couples, their differing views are not really either or, but when they think about their relationship, it's both and. And so I think when you can just validate, you don't necessarily have to agree or like in the picture, always see the old woman or always see the young woman first. But if you can understand why they see it the way they see it, it changes things, and then you can approach things from a different stance.
So what I think I'm hearing you say then is, let's go back to this religion piece, and let's say that we do have children together. As much as I can validate why my partner's religion or spiritual views has meaning to them and has served them and has been an incredibly helpful coping skill throughout the course of their life, and we're looking at what are we going to model for our children or what are we going to introduce them to, then this idea that like we both have found strength through our experiences of faith, and that has served us well. Why would you want to take that away from our child? Why wouldn't we want to introduce both?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think I've known I've got some good friends of mine where they come from two different religious backgrounds. It's interesting because they're siblings. The two siblings, one of them, they come from a Christian background, but one of them married a Muslim and the other one married somebody that was Jewish. And so you talk about a confluence of different backgrounds. And what they've learned to do is to kind of integrate both and recognize the importance of doing those different traditions at different times in different ways, without this ultimatum of you have to do it this way kind of thing. And I think, too, with couples, the good news is you get to come up with your own rules about how you want to operate and how you want to be. And so, if you want to, integrate the two religious views, and that could be a very rich thing, and create some meaning. And I think too,
we're the family of our choice now versus the one that we were born into. So there is a new structure coming in place.
Right. And and I think the to me the opportunity is to really have people seek meaning together. I'm always reminded of Viktor Frankl in his book Man's Search for Meaning, and essentially kind of a quote or a paraphrase of a quote of his is that if we don't have meaning in our life, we will substitute pleasure. Pleasure is good, but in the long run, it's kind of empty. But if we have meaning in our life, that's where we can find contentment and purpose and all of those kinds of things.
So if we're constantly eating Chinese food, we're never going to feel full.
Right. Right. It's a good way of putting it. Yeah.
Hey, I'm just trying to break it down, Gordon. I'm
just
trying to keep it
real. Right.
Okay, so let's shift to something else that I know that you work with that is important to talk about. And when we have couples whose partners identify as having an addiction to sex or problematic pornography use, I think that I would love to hear your perspective, because there's so much controversy in the therapy world. I don't know if it's getting better, but when I first started becoming a therapist, whether or not there was even an agreement that was actually an addiction or a problematic behavior, give me your perspective on that. What is that?
Yeah. So I don't have a real, I think if a person is addicted to pornography or sex or any addiction, as far as that goes, I think they have to really recognize it for themselves first, because what might seem like an addiction to me on the outside might not be exactly what they experience in the internal world. But one of the things I will say is that if somebody is participating or involved in any activity that creates disconnection or pulls them away from those relationships that are life-giving, that are healthy, all those kinds of things, then it's probably a problem. You could apply that to alcohol, to drugs, sex, gambling, any of those kinds of things. But the other thing too is that I think any addiction, particularly sex and pornography addictions, are really born out of a sense of loneliness and isolation. And that when people are lonely, and this goes back to what I said about Viktor Frankl's quote, there's a huge dopamine rush with pornography, and especially I think for men, that it just sends off all the bells and whistles. And that's because we're biological creatures, and that's how we're created and how our bodies operate. If you're seeking pleasure rather than meaningful relationships, that's going to be a problem. And so I think a person has to really kind of look and dive deep into that. And, unfortunately, a lot of times when people are coming to me, dealing with those kinds of issues, they've run into a crisis in their relationships, or they've taken it too far in that the pornography addiction has turned into a full-blown sex addiction, in which they're seeking out anonymous partners and all the damage that causes in their primary relationship. So it all comes back to connection and understanding what true intimacy is about, not so much ooh la la intimacy as much as it is about two people being vulnerable with each other. And so I think that's where those things begin. And so I think people having to really dig deep and looking at those things is really where the work begins.
So you would know that it was problematic if you were the person that was, using pornography or, was with multiple partners that are not consensual situations where
Right.
you're kind of feeling that you want to keep withdrawing from your partner, that you don't want to share an intimacy, and that sometimes this just feels like a reward for yourself or something that you don't have to worry about engaging emotionally, that you can do this physical pleasure, and then it's becoming problematic because you're thinking about it more often, you're craving it, I've had clients that purposely create distance from their partner so that they can, maybe pick a fight with them so that they can have the space physically and mentally to go participate in these behaviors. And so if you're feeling yourself withdrawing more from your partner and as a way to seek out this behavior, then that's the starting of maybe a sign for yourself that is becoming problematic.
Right. Or if you notice you're planning your day around the opportunities to watch porn or engage in those activities, that there's a problem there. And when you look at it, it kind of parallels the same kind of patterns of behavior that you see with drug addicts or people that have alcohol problems, those kinds of things. Yeah. They're kind of preoccupied with it, and that their life is kind of, okay, everything else is not important, but this is.
How would you suggest that a partner, who is in a relationship with someone who's experiencing this problematic behavior, how would they approach it? How would they say, hey, I'm feeling this is something that we need to seek more support around?
Yeah. And I think, that's always one of those tough conversations to have. But I think, certainly doing it as gently as possible, being able to say, I'm concerned about you. I'm seeing this pattern and I'm feeling more and more disconnected from you. I want our relationship to work, that sort of thing. And unfortunately, sometimes it comes down to an ultimatum, either, kind of you fix this or else kind of thing. And so that's a whole different starting point, in working with couples than, hey, I'm recognizing this pattern and I want to understand you to do something about it because it's affecting me.
Is that a recommendation for your clients that they develop what their boundaries are around their partner's problematic behavior? Like, do you encourage them to, once they've asked for this, which was super hard to do, right? And if the other partner placated them, wasn't willing to, was continuing to do behaviors that, were relapsing, what would you tell the partner that's on the receiving end of this? What's their task?
Yeah. So I would say you have to figure out for yourself, what are the deal breakers? What is kind of what is your bottom line for this? And, the problem is that you can't force your partner to change. No. All you can do is invite them to the process of change and be vulnerable enough to let them know how it's affecting themselves, affecting the person on the receiving end. And hopefully they've got enough compassion or enough empathy around that to be able to begin to make the change and want to, go through the process of change. The other side, unfortunately, of that is that they approach their partner with, okay, this is a problem for me. This is something that doesn't make me feel good. I feel rejected. I feel, disconnected, all of those kinds of things. And they really have to make those hard decisions over, okay, do I stay in the relationship or do I leave the relationship?
So, for those people that are listening that don't have a spiritual belief or a faith based belief, how would then, if they were in the midst of a crisis like this, hopefully they'd be going to therapy with someone like you,
Hmm.
right? But there
Right.
is also this extra support that's coming through their faith. What does that look like? What is that process for those of us that are like, I don't know what you're doing over there, Gordon, but like if
Yeah.
I went to see you as the deacon, what would happen?
Yeah. So really kind of the bottom line of, faith, at least to me, it's about community. It's
Mm,
about connecting with people around common common beliefs, common mindset, like-mindedness about different things. And I think that is the important part of it. That's what brings it together. Um, you know, I tell people all the time, I can't prove to you one way or another the existence of God. I
mm,
mean, I just don't have any way to prove that empirically. But, I know from my own life experiences, I've felt something greater than myself.
yeah.
And so I think we can connect to those things that are greater than ourselves, that have a meaning in our life. Um, you know, in whatever way that is. But I think, again, when somebody's going through a crisis, they don't need to white knuckle it through alone. They need to find support. And so reaching out to, people that are friends, people that are, a community that are, across the country, there are numerous support groups and that sort of thing. And I think that is a way for people to connect. I mean, even in recovery groups, a lot of people, whether they are, you know, believe in a higher being or a higher power or whatever, they see the group as their higher power, and that there's something there that gives us strength, gives us support, those kinds of things.
So, would you encourage then that a couple that had a faith based component to their relationship and they were going through a crisis,
Hmm.
something important like an addiction or loss of a child
Hmm.
or potentially divorce, that they
Hmm.
would be served by having this additional layer of support and empathy and a place to kind of have some peers that maybe have gone through the same thing?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. It's one of the things too is just finding the right community. I mean, and there's no one size fits all. I mean, if you look at religion in America, there are so many different denominations and so many different ways to approach kind of the same thing around some of the same core beliefs, but they've got different ways of getting there. And so there's lots of different paths. And I think a person and a couple needs to find the path that speaks to them,
Yeah.
and works for them.
So maybe you don't know the answer to this question, but this is something that I've heard come up for many of my clients. I have, as I'm sure you do, clients that have not had a great experience with religion for whatever reason.
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
typically say, people are what screw up religion, not religion screwing up religion, right? But
Hmm.
for whatever reason, they've had an event that has been incredibly traumatic or painful, and but they
Yeah.
still seek this spirituality. Like, it isn't that isn't
Right.
the reason that they're not going anymore, and they're wanting to, like, and craving to have this additional component back in their life. What
Hmm.
do they do with that fear? How would they approach a church so that they could put them on notice that, hey, I've had a bad experience, no pressure, but you need to make this right? How do
Right.
they get their head around that and go about it?
Yeah. So there, in my work, I've had a lot of people come to me that have really kind of experienced what I would classify as spiritual abuse, in that they were handed messages and ideas, and certainly you don't have to look far to understand that, even within the church, there's been a lot of abuse.
Yeah.
There've been, people that have been sexually abused. There've been people that have been taken advantage of, and unfortunately, we're all, you're dealing with human beings with even within the church. And I would say for a person that is looking for some sort of spiritual connection, is that there's, again, one size doesn't fit all. And there are a lot of churches, Christian, and I would say even within other religions, that might have more of a progressive look at things. They're not as based in kind of this hardcore evangelical fundamentalist kind of way of seeing things, and that there's room to ask questions, to doubt, to wonder, all of those kinds of things, and not have to stick hard and fast to these are the rules, this is what it says, and if you don't believe this, you're going to hell, kind of thing. And that's, I think that's where a lot of that comes from with the spiritual abuse of things. And again, at least in my view and my point of view on this is that way of thinking about things is based in fear rather than based in love and compassion and kindness. And I think that's where, at least where I hope that I'm helping people get to that, and that they experience church, or they experience spirituality in a very gentle and kind and loving way, rather than this harsh, oh, your God's going to get you kind of way.
Because you should be able to, in a healthy religion or spirituality or group, be able to tolerate somebody saying, I don't quite understand that. Here's parts where it's not working for me. Mm-hmm. Can you give me some more context, or can you help me understand the part that you're saying here that I'm missing the link, without it creating mm-hmm. defensiveness? That it's healthy conversation. You don't have to convince them. You just need to have, what do we have in common, right? We all want to have a wonderful life, and here's one option.
Right. I would much rather have somebody questioning and doubting all of this stuff than somebody that is, okay, this is how it is, and I'm sure about it. I share with, needless to say, in part of my work, I do some spiritual direction with people. And, at least in my own experience, I don't put so much stock in belief, because there are a lot of things about the Bible and about religion that are just not believable. I mean, it's just, particularly living in the 21st century with science and what we know about the universe and all of that kind of thing. Some of the stories in the Bible just don't line up with that.
Right.
And so what's to me, at least what my religion and my theology has evolved into, is not so much about what I believe or don't believe, but more about a way of life and a way of ordering myself, and the way I treat others, and the practices I do on, rituals and all of that kind of thing that bring meaning to me. I don't know that there's any kind of hocus pocus magic around it, but it's just, it brings meaning. And so I think finding those things that you can practice that bring meaning for you, for a lot, you talk to anybody that's been a long-term practicer of meditation, or even yoga, or any of those kinds of things.
Yes.
They can tell you the meaning that it brings for them, and how it brings them comfort and that kind of thing. So that's the kind of stuff that I really try to get people to help people understand.
Yeah. I want to read a quote that I got from your website that I think sort of sums up what I view about you and the beautiful part of your personality. So here's what I got from your website, Gordon. Okay. As I tell people that come to me for therapy, one's spiritual life is a personal thing. I am certainly influenced by my own spirituality and religious beliefs. Sometimes when people come in to see me, I do have on my quote unquote funny collar, which is your clerical collar, but I also make it a point for them to know that I do not push any sort of religious agenda in my therapy practice. I am comfortable talking about spiritual, faithful issues, but each person's religious path is unique. Our religious lives can be a path for healing. I am happy to share that with people, but it will never be forced upon them.
Yeah.
Why is that so important? Do you make a point of saying, hey, I own this space, but I'm not going to force you into that space? Why is that so important for your clients to hear and for couples to know?
Well, I think for one thing, just looking at, kind of the demographics of where I'm located in the world, I'm in Northeast Tennessee. And as I like to say, it's the belt buckle of the Bible Belt, in that there's a lot of really ultra conservative values and ways of seeing things in this area. And a lot of people have been hurt by that. And so I think as much as anything, therapy has to be a safe space for people.
Yes.
And so I think that's the one thing that I want them to know, and I want to be able to convey to people, is that I'm hopefully a safe person for them to be with and to share, their most inner world. That's where therapy is. And yeah, hopefully I'm answering your question there.
You're doing a
Dana.
great
Yeah,
job. No,
yeah.
I like that you're kind of bringing up this piece about in the belt buckle of the Bible. I imagine I live in San Diego, so it's not quite the
Mhm.
same. But if I were
Right.
living in your part of the world and I was going through a sex addiction, let's say, which is something that
Hmm.
you specialize in, I'm going to go to a therapist in the Bible Belt who's going to tell me I'm going to hell, or like that I'm
Hmm.
not following the teaching. And
Hmm.
where would you go? I mean, I'm assuming that if you've
Hmm.
had trauma with religion, that doesn't feel like an option. There's some
Hmm.
therapists that are telling you that that's not a real thing. And if there was more of a bend towards a religious aspect, where the heck would I go? Like, you're like
Right.
this little oasis in the storm. And is that got you any flack? Is that something that you've had to like defend yourself about?
Yeah, so far it has not. And as a matter of fact, I would say that is one reason why our practice stays full, is that we
Mm,
provide that space for
yeah.
people to see things in other ways, and to be able to understand stuff in other ways. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the reasons that I wanted to, as much as I admire you and your docile tone is always so soothing to me, I really just wanted to introduce this idea that you can have somebody help you who has a different perspective, who believes in spirituality in a different way than you do. And it doesn't mean they're not
Hmm.
going to be helpful. It doesn't mean you're not going to find support. In fact, you can maybe even take a couple of tools away from your view of the world that give a different perspective or help in a different
Hmm.
way. I just really want to open up this conversation that there doesn't have to be one right way, and you don't have to be
Hmm.
seeking out a certain kind of clinician to get the support that maybe you didn't know that you could get.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I think, yeah, in seeking out, people that are seeking out therapists or whatever, and I tell people this too, is that if at any time what we're doing is not working for you, let me know that, and I'll help you
Yes.
find somebody else. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, I think
Hmm.
that that's important. That's an important conversation for anybody listening to say, listen, if you don't like the way the therapist talks to you, if you don't like the way that they explain things, if you don't like the method that they're using, you get to use your voice. This is not about our ego. This is about you finding the
Hmm.
support and practicing healthy boundaries in a safe environment, which is therapy.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. Yeah.
Because the opposite could happen if I accidentally went into a clinician's office who was not giving me the kind of support that came at me from some perspective that felt threatening or hurtful or
Hmm.
harmful. I
Yeah.
want them to speak up, and that's
Right.
expected. And I just love that you support that as well, where
Hmm.
stereotypically
Yeah.
we might be under the belief that we are going to have a different experience.
Right, right. Yeah. And I think, I think another whole area, just kind of related to sexuality, is just folks that are LGBTQ plus
Yeah.
folks, um, having, at least here in our area, having a refuge of where they can be themselves and know that they're not going to be labeled in some way, or somebody's not going to try to convince them that they need to be another way, and or that sort of thing, and that, how they're born and how they feel is just as much what God made as anybody else. So, I mean, that's, again, a lot of folks don't hear that from folks that consider themselves Christian, but I can tell you that there's a whole lot of us out there that embrace that.
Great. Thank you for saying that, Gordon. That is one of the reasons I really value knowing you and sharing your perspective, is because I genuinely can vouch for that. It doesn't matter who it is. I think that they would feel heard, seen, validated, and safe in your presence. So thank you for sharing your thoughts and your beliefs with us.
Oh, thanks.
So talk about your podcast again. Tell me the name again. So I will put it in the show notes, but I didn't even know, so I'm going to be subscribing. What's it called?
Yes. So there's the Practice of Therapy podcast, which is really geared towards therapists. But the other one is just simply the Kindness and Compassion podcast. And you can find it at kindnessandcompassion.com. And also my podcast and the Kindness and Compassion podcast is part of a network now called the Sightcraft Network, which is something that I got started this past year as well. And so,
you're just a mover and a shaker. I better not take my eye off you. Every time I turn around, you're doing something new. Okay.
Yeah.
Good. So, well, again, thank you. I'm so honored that I got to turn the tables and interview you for a chance. This was super fun.
It was my honor. Thanks.
Stay in touch, please, Gloria, and I wish you the very best.
Thanks. You too, Dana.
Thanks for tuning into the D-Spot. Find me, Dr. Dana McNeil, and my guests on social media using the links down below. Subscribe for new episodes weekly and leave a comment letting us know how and if you can relate or what topics you'd like us to cover next. See you next time, and don't forget, go into therapy is cool.